May I have your attention? Thank you for making it here at breakfast time after some had quite a late night. And a very interesting night it was too. Now, we're starting, of course, with the panel and the similar format you're now familiar with. And the same rules apply. And we'll have this panel over breakfast. Then we have to have a break where we have to exit this room so they can clean up breakfast and come back for another panel. The break will only be short. We've got a compressed timetable today. Now, let me introduce panel 8, which is different from the others, perhaps less technical, being a CEO forum where chief executives can provide their perspective on the issues that we've been discussing over the last couple of days. And Paul Gilding is a member of the panel as well, taking a perspective perhaps more as God than a CEO, but I'm sure he'll put his money's worth in. Once again, the bios are in the pack. The chairman is Bill Marin, the managing director of SC50, and I'd like to hand over now to Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I believe this morning's session is one that complements the last couple of days of conversation in a very, very important way. And that as you think about our approach to creating alignment, driving innovation, it is absolutely critical today that you have that at the senior-most level in your companies. So the focus of today's conversation will really be to take the CEO perspective and try to connect it to the thoughts and ideas we've been sharing. And through this conversation, take key initiatives that we believe are critical to the success of supply chain today and talk about each and then balance them. And we were very fortunate today to have Scott Price with us, who's CEO of Walmart Asia, and will be here to weigh in, challenge, press, stretch our thinking on how supply chain can better communicate the challenge to the senior-most officer in your companies and bring value that is synchronized with the agenda of the CEO. So, Scott, we're really looking forward to your thoughts. To get us started, what I thought would be very helpful to you all as you have breakfast is to really get to know the panelists that are here today, so you have a perspective of where they're coming from and their perspective on CEO leadership as well. So I've asked each panelist to introduce themselves and to share not only a snapshot of their background and how they have risen to where they are today, but also to share a CEO name with you that has been particularly meaningful to them and that a CEO that they believe has brought unique leadership, particularly from an operational excellence perspective, supply chain perspective, that might be important for all of us to consider as we go forward. So as the panelists kind of shape their thoughts and ideas on that front, I thought I would share with you a little bit of my background. As mentioned, I'm the managing director for Supply Chain 50. Supply Chain 50 is an organization that brings together top supply chain leaders for off-the-record dialogue in an environment that is non-competitive and geared to address the global challenges facing the senior-most supply chain leader today. So my role and background in doing that has afforded me unique time and opportunity to work with senior leaders, including a number of well-respected CEOs. So when I think of this question of what CEO do I most admire that I think has really played a strategic role in helping shape the supply chain agenda, the name that I would put forward to this group is Larry Bossidy. Larry is a CEO that led the Honeywell Corporation, wrote the book Execution, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. At least for myself, it came at a time in my career where shaping my management approach was particularly important. And the role that Larry plays today in my life is one that is geared to helping me shape the conversations with supply chain leaders and to make sure they understand the strategic agenda that a CEO is challenged with serving, and at the same time create value in those conversations for the executive team. So this issue of alignment, issue of driving a leadership perspective and achieving conversations that work cross-functionally in the enterprise are things that Larry's particularly good at. And the last point I would share with you is in a recent conversation inside our circle, Larry really expressed to the group that if there's one thing that's changed in his mind as he looks at what makes global corporations effective today and what makes CEOs effective today, he shared that if he was picking a successor today for the CEO role, he would want that successor to have experience in supply chain, which I think is an important statement for the importance that your role plays in today's operating environment and how supply chain as a leadership position has evolved. So I put that to the group. Hopefully that's interesting food for thought. And let me now just introduce this group and ask them to share as well. So Paul, you want to introduce yourself and kick us off?
So I won't go through my background so much after you had most of that last night, but the thing I wanted to say about the CEO issue, I think, is I spent the last 15, 20 years working with CEOs of large corporates around sustainability. And the one that stands out for me in that whole process is Chad Holliday, Chairman CEO of DuPont. And the reason was that I think it's a company that led with values, that knew what it stood for, knew what its culture was, and it was a very powerful culture, most famously around safety, but increasingly around sustainability and its role in terms of driving change in the broader market. And Chad I particularly appreciated in this context of supply chain because he understood that to manage his company, he needed to manage his stakeholder group. And therefore he would engage his suppliers quite deeply and customers, not just around the product and price and efficiency and all the things that you would expect, but would also engage them around what they believed in and what they stood for and how they could actually make a change in the world to be a better place. And did that in a very commercial way, so not as a sort of a proselytising kind of argument about philosophy, but saying, look, we need to achieve this change, so we need to work together for the greater good of our companies, but also our society. And that, I think, that idea of social purpose, the idea of the role of the corporation at the centre of a system, I think is a different way of seeing the world. And what we tend to otherwise do sometimes in the business community is to manage our own situation as though it exists in isolation. And complain about government, complain about this, complain about that. But recognising that, yes, we need to actually work together in that process, I think, is a really important one. And Chad was particularly powerful in that role. He's now Chairman of Bank of America, so he's got some challenges ahead, I think, in that regard.
That's terrific. Peter, you want to introduce yourself and be sure to give the group a sense for how your career track has progressed and how you've achieved your role as CEO of Port of Salalah.
Good morning, everyone. Everybody has their mouth full, sorry, so I shouldn't have asked for a response. First, I guess I will start with Port of Salalah, and probably to put it in context, why the heck is a port that I've never heard of being represented here at a high-level supply chain conference? And without going into all the background about getting to know John and his vision and all of that, I'll start by saying I'm one of those people that didn't fall into this industry. I went to a transportation academy, to the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I was a freight forwarder for a few years. So this discussion of asset light, I know how much money can be made with a phone and a desk. It's quite an amazing thing. And then I've also gone all the way to asset heavy, so into the ports industry, working for a global port operator, APM Terminals. I've been all over the world with them. I am one of those Americans with a passport. It has stamps in it also, not just from Caribbean countries. Thank you, Mark, yes. I am also one of those Americans who can speak more than one language, yeah, and it's more than just being able to order a beer in Mexico. So those are some positives. I've operated in New York, in Houston, in LA, Oakland, so as far as supply chains go, I've probably touched most of your containers, your goods, your materials, some point in my time. I've also been the CEO of 3 ports, one in Oakland, one in Kingston, Jamaica, and now Port of Salalah. I was also a COO for our entire region in Europe. We had around 10 ports around Europe, the Mediterranean, and Northern Africa. So then you say, well, Pete, what did you do to be sent to Oman? And for those of you who don't know, Oman is not Amman, it's not Jordan, it's the country that's just south of the UAE and on the east coast of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And actually, it's not like being sent to Siberia. It is a nice place, other than the difference is that it's warm instead of cold. It's quite an interesting role, and again, I'm probably in the middle of many of your supply chains, you just don't know it. We do around 4 million TEUs a year, so we are a global port. We have the top carriers that utilize us to increase their networks, to make it possible to service some of the more difficult parts of the world that you may or may not be interested in, the East Africa market, the India market, the Gulf, of course. So these types of things, this connectivity, we find ourselves at a fairly decent nexus point. We also do 7 million tons of general cargo and have 3,200 vessels a year calling. So it's quite a decent-sized port with a fair amount of benefits behind the port and the free zone and whatnot. And I have some colleagues that are here also with that. But it's a very interesting country for those of you who haven't visited. I know John's been there quite a bit, and from a dollar-fixed economy to low inflation rates, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not as bad as it may sound that I've been relocated to Oman. Then we had this conversation about CEOs and who do I admire the most and why. And that was a tough assignment for me. I don't know if it would be the same for all of you. Because when I scratch the surface, we could easily go to the recent, the Steve Jobs of the world and the Waltons. And I mean, there's just so many out there that have been successful. But I guess when I looked at it, 4 names came to mind. So I'm not going to pick one. I'm going to pick 4 names, and not the people in particular, but then I'll say what ties them together in my mind. And it's Eisenhower, it's Disney. Those two usually don't get mentioned in the same sentence together. It's Steve Jobs and then Truman. And I'll say, I think when I think of those guys, it's this idea of adversity and making tough decisions, and with a focus toward a vision, right, and driving toward it. And each of them, I won't go into each one, but each of them had their own points in time where it seems like they contributed a significant amount toward society or toward the world and delivering their vision, but under circumstances that, where people were telling them that's not going to work, or no, that isn't the way forward. And I think as a CEO, that's the biggest challenge from my perspective in my business and in my professional life, is having these visions of where we want to go and rallying not just the people that work for you, but the people you work for, the people you work with, and society around you, to say, all those people that say, no, that's not right, and you can't do that. And overcoming that's a skill.
That's terrific, Peter. Thank you so much. I think that's very complimentary of what, as you think about CEOs that really do better under pressure, but at the same time push the envelope with their organizations to do the right thing and to think more broadly about the issues that can really make a difference in the world. So, Dr. Rajiva Sarkar, please introduce ourselves and perhaps take a moment as well to introduce the S.P. Jain School of Management to the group.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I am an academician working with S.P. Jain School of Global Management. The core competency as of date is logistics and supply chain management. And when I say as of date, it is because when I graduated, it was mechanical engineer. When I post-graduated, it was international business. And when I did my PhD, it was logistics and supply chain management. So as we see that we are living in a dynamic world, and as the environment around us changes, so do we. I'm sure that most of you of my generation have shared the similar progression. S.P. Jain has a campus in Dubai where I am based. We have a campus in Singapore, and we have an upcoming campus in Sydney. Some of the specializations that we offer besides global logistics and supply chain management is consulting management, contemporary marketing, finance, and information technology. As a professor in the class, let me share my experience with you. The first day of supply chain management class, and I have a cohort coming from different industry. A typical class has a number of engineers with a background of work, having worked in IT, manufacturing, so on and so forth. Another segment of the class, people having worked as accountants. Third segment of the class, people having worked in marketing, and all of them specializing in different areas. All of them have to study supply chain management as a compulsory subject. And when you say compulsory, that raises a lot of eyebrows. And why I'm sitting in this class? I'm going to specialize in finance. I'm going to specialize in information technology. And the challenge is that at the end of it, each one of them, if they have some appreciation of what supply chain management can do to an enterprise, that is the success of the course. Having said that, besides these courses, we are very much involved in executive education. We have an honors program where we attract the industry to depute their upcoming executives to do their post-graduation at our campus. And over a period of time, I have seen our alumni maturing into successful and upcoming professionals in Southeast Asia, Middle East, and in India. Bill has posed an interesting challenge to all of us about the CEOs which we admire. And without hesitation, I would say it is Ratan Tata. I come from India, and I'm sure that Tata is a name. Whether a person in India is rich or poor, everyone knows. Tata Group of Industries have touched everyone's life in India. And I'm sure that this name is very well known across the world. Ratan Tata took over the reins of Tata Group. He became the chairman in 1991. And this was the time Indian economy was liberated. It had thrown away the shackles of its old baggage. And Ratan Tata led from the front, transformed this company into a giant which we are seeing it today. How do I relate supply chain management with Ratan Tata? This is not really about supply chain management, but still I would like to give you an example. Tata decided to introduce Nano car, which is a $2,000 car, a huge challenge. So starting with the price tag and then engineering it is in fact was the biggest challenge. When it came to the choice of location for this plant, it was in West Bengal. And when the local government refused to give them land for their suppliers park, he took a decision to move out and go to Gujarat. It's a tough decision. It's a supply chain decision. And he took it and has proved that he was right. Thank you, Bill.
Fantastic. Yeah, you know, I had the fortune of being with Ratan Tata this past fall, and you know, making tough decisions, driving multinational through unprecedented acquisitions and the complexity of the business. One thing that stood out for me was that he was the CEO that truly surrounded himself with great people as well.
Quality
So,
of a great leader.
Yeah, fantastic choice. So Scott, we're again very happy to have you with us today and interested to learn more about you. So it'd be great to have you share with the group. And I'll just add that through conversations here over the last couple of days, there have been repeated statements and connections made back to you just through your background in supply chain and familiarity with this group. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm a simple retailer representing a relatively small retail company. And if one were to look at the global nature of retail, despite its size, it's highly fragmented. So we're relatively small. And as mentioned by Bill, my background for many years was in logistics. And I may or may not have played the reason why Walmart asked me several years ago to take on the role of leading our development in Asia. So Walmart in Asia, we're only in 3 countries at this point: Japan, India, and China. Okay, those are 3 pretty big countries, and they represent a huge lion's share of the GDP of the region. Wildly different markets, both economically, both in terms of supply chain complexity versus the length of domestic versus international supply chain. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of conversations around that. In terms of CEO, that's a really hard one. I must say that I personally believe leadership is situational, that I have met some very fine, admirable individuals who have failed spectacularly as leaders just purely because the situation didn't fit their skills or needs. So I think that we hero worship many of the visionaries. Certainly Sam Walton, I believe, was a great visionary. Steve Jobs, as mentioned by Peter. And you can get into Henry Ford and individuals who truly were not only able to connect a need that they saw, but also drive large economic organizations. So I'd reflect more on who I think has affected me most in life, and it was in fact a college professor 30-some years ago, more years than I'd like to actually admit to, but who took the time to help me achieve. At that point, didn't even have a passport, had this desire of seeing the world, of understanding what it would take to create an international career. And Professor Wall went out of his way and helped me get into graduate school, et cetera. And I left the United States in 1989 and very much have moved 9 times internationally in 20-some years. My wife is a saint. I then have taken that and try and pay that back, as they say. So try and give back to individuals, younger people who are trying to figure out what their career is and how to grapple with this much more complex world of business. So I think he probably had the greatest impact on me. There's many CEOs I admire, but it would be very difficult for me to just pick one.
Well, Scott, I just comment on that by saying I think that as leaders today and leaders that have really influenced and made a difference in our lives, I think of them as being 2 things, both interesting and interested. So what I'm hearing you say is that leaders that take interest in you and really giving back from the perspective of helping you take advantage of their experience, perspective, connections is a critical thing. In fact, on our women's panel yesterday, I think we heard that as well, that it wasn't so much the mentorship as it was the guidance that made a difference. So I think that's a very valuable perspective. So to advance our agenda, the thought I had was to take several initiatives that each representative of the panel actually has in their background and leverage that from the perspective of being the most important thing that Scott should think of as a CEO in driving Walmart today. Maybe even make it a little bit of a competition. So we're going to have these 3 perspectives weighed in, and then I'd like to get feedback from you all on the initiatives that are top of mind for you that might be even more important than the initiatives that we've raised. And we've certainly talked about a number of them over the last couple of days. But let's start with Peter. No doubt your perspective on trade raises some interesting angles on both, particularly from the Port of Salalah, innovative new ideas for how trade can be, better leveraged in today's corporation. Why don't share with Scott your perspective on why trade would be perhaps the most important thing to be thinking of today in terms of opportunity for improving the operational excellence or just the advancement and responsiveness of his supply chain.
Yeah, that's a big call, and I'll try not to make it a competition because I think what we'll see is clearly that we have a lot of balls in the air. But just pulling a couple of things from some of the discussions we've had at the beginning of this conference, quotes that say we need a business appropriate supply chain, and of course that's a very ambiguous phrase. It's a great phrase, but it's ambiguous in that business appropriate is a snapshot and changes probably minute by minute. Trade as a whole, right? What we see is growth is still there. Cargo growth is still globally there. The world is not in a full on recession, as they were a few years ago. The shipping lines, the backbone of what carries 95% of all of our trade, they're in a deep hole. They've dug. You could argue they've dug it themselves. There's significant excess capacity. Interesting things generating from now, alliances and significant rate wars, market share battles, etc. Fuel prices, of course, being an interesting part of that as well. This idea that we've also discussed a number of times over the last few days of flexibility chips versus efficiency chips. And I think a lot of people are trying to play both. So when we then take one step back again to the very first session and we hear about design thinking and John's model, we start talking about throwing away what we know today and starting fresh, taking this blank piece of paper. And I would say that it's very difficult to do that, even if you are starting fresh, simply because of the number of players with legacy nodes and legacy ways of doing things and assets that need to be filled or that are desired to be filled. So how do you then break out of those molds and create something new when your vendors and your providers are asking you to fill up their massive investment warehouse in location A or location B or location C? So we see, as everybody else reads the same papers, inflation rates in China driving up labor costs. We see movement of manufacturing to other places again, some staying, some moving. Fuel prices increasing and making it more and more difficult to do business. So when I start thinking about supply chains and I start thinking about what I would want to be if I were in a small retail company as a CEO, I would say that maybe it's more like I need my supply chain to be more like a cruise missile than a bullet. Today they seem more like bullets. And so they're fast, and we fire it from one end, and it comes out the other. And then, there's a last mile piece of it. But there's a huge piece in between that says it's just on the way, right? And now we've been impacted by shipping lines going slow steaming and adding 5, 6, 7 days, depending on your routes, to the overall transit times. And that must have a small impact on the net working capital for a company like Walmart or the vendors that they utilize. So I would say that maybe this idea of flexibility, this idea of being a cruise missile, in other words, being able to reprogram and redirect in midstream when appropriate. So this business appropriate supply chains is incredibly important. And then we have to stand back and design a network that allows that to happen. And then that's not necessarily only taking advantage of economies of scale at the beginning and at the end, where we ship and manufacture and where we consolidate and then distribute, but somewhere in the middle to inject, somewhere in the middle to buffer, somewhere. It's not exactly lean thinking, but at the same time, what we've seen with political unrest, with environmental issues, tsunamis and earthquakes and flooding and et cetera. They have massive impacts. And we did a little research, not a huge amount, but some fairly high-level stuff with some experts on what would have happened had there been a small set of units, manufacturing or distribution, on the supply chain from Asia to Europe when the floods in Thailand happened, and what would have been the impact to the spare parts in Europe, and the drastic reduction in the impact would have been felt. I mean, there was a significant delay, as we all know, in being able to get those spare parts to market, and that's where a lot of the auto companies make their money, is in the pieces, not in the whole. So I think, the idea, actually, of what should the CEO believe in the most is really knowing the right questions to ask. It's a little bit about supply chain, but it's actually more about business as a whole. And it's, how do I ask the right questions so that I don't get the answer that I know is going to come from the guy or the person in front of me? Because you don't want the expected. You want what's really the underlying issue. What is it that I have to ask, and who do I have to ask it from? And cast that net a little bit wider than what you would expect it to be. So instead of just asking your 3PL, or instead of just asking your freight forwarder, or just asking your supply chain guy, ask 2 levels down in the organization when it comes to implementing things, or outside the organization within the chain. What is it you're seeing? What are the trends that you're witnessing? Because there are some very interesting perspectives out there, and there's the difference between data and information, but the ability to take that data on board at least and understand and let it percolate is I think that's the skill.
So that's great. So you really kind of took trade, drew the line to this cruise missile versus bullets, make it more programmable, challenging Scott to maybe think more strategically about how he programs it for the supply chain for more agility at Walmart. But then you backed up and you said, wait a minute, the real issue here is asking the right questions, which, Scott, I think is a good way for us to tee up perhaps your bigger view of supply chain. So maybe you could start there and kind of what you think is the most important aspect of supply chain today to be focused on, and then bridge it back to Peter's charge to you, which is this cruise missile analogy.
Just to be clear, in your metaphor, the cruise missile comes by container ship, right?
Some of it, yeah. 95% of it.
Yeah, it's a very complex topic. 20 years ago, supply chain, it felt like kind of one generation above knuckle draggers, right? Just sort of a bunch of guys in a back room, who took long coffee breaks and moved things around. Supply chain is hideously complex today. And if you look at what has happened, supply chain is basically a reactive mechanism to fulfill better economic supply and demand dynamics that have just changed so much over the last 20 or 30 years. If you look at the planet's ability to give 6 billion people a aspirational middle-class standard of living through basic goods, etc., the chasing of wage arbitrage, the chasing of sort of the dynamics of where supply takes place versus demand, again, has changed dramatically. Your average middle-class person anywhere in the world expects to have apples 365 days a year. They expect to have what they want, when they want it, at a great quality, at a great price. They make their decisions based upon, I want to feel good about that purchase. And it needs to be sustainable, it needs to be kind to the environment, it'd be really nice if it didn't hurt the oceans, et cetera, a long checklist. But I will pay you exactly 1 cent more than the guy across the street to deliver that to me. And so the expectation of cost is huge. So when you're in a world that has such high level of awareness via media, not only in terms of what's happening in the world, forming opinions, but also the view as to what's a fair cost for things, it's hard to be a simple retailer. You know, the slowdown that has happened in China is not a change in real incomes. It's a perception of risk coming forward in terms of Spanish banks and the Greek crisis and a slowdown in the United States. And suddenly you have a mother who walks into a store and says, well, rather than buying 3 pairs of summer shorts for my child, I'm only going to buy 2 pairs. The longer supply chain and the ability to predict those sorts of things, it's more and more difficult relative to the level of speed of consumption. It's a lot easier on daily consumables, in particular food stuff, much harder on general merchandise. So to me, the bullet versus the cruise missile metaphor relative to the speed of supply chains has a lot to do with economics, because ultimately you're trying to balance speed with cost of holding inventory. And if your demand is highly unpredictable, the incremental cost of speed is a far greater risk mitigator in terms of financials than putting it on the ocean and potentially having 3 times the inventory that you need. And every company faces this dilemma. We face it on the ultimate step of deciding how we actually go to market for our customers. But you have companies and the parts, the materials throughout that entire supply chain leading up to that final product that we purchase, making similar decisions throughout. So I think that the cost pressure is what's driving a lot of the decisions. I think that a lot of the decisions are being made based upon a lack of comfort or confidence in what demand will be. The world's inability to accurately predict supply and demand dynamics is seen everywhere. And a simple example will be the amount of food that's going to be left after this meal and the caloric imbalance that occurs in wealthier places versus we all feel that compassion for less wealthy places that have starvation levels. The planet can sustain calorically the population today. It's the misbalance of supply and demand and the supply chains in between that is mucking it up so badly. Therefore, supply chain's a lot more important than it was 20 years ago, in my simple view.
That's
Mom,
great.
Mom was right. Eat everything on your plate because they're starving people.
Yeah, but unfortunately, there's places in the world that's got too much on its plate. That's a different issue we don't necessarily need to start.
Well, I think this would be a good time to kind of look to the group and see if we have questions and perspective to be raised. I see Roddy.
I love the analogy of the bullet versus the cruise missile. My question goes to strategy execution. There's no shortage of supply chain nuts and bolts. We've probably got more data than what we can use in IT and the supply chains. The real challenge, though, and there's also no shortage of consultants that can develop fancy strategies. The problem is in execution. And the question I have for you is, how do you integratively execute all those initiatives and keep the organizational effectiveness and health up? Because to me, that's the role. In companies that I've seen it done successfully, P&G, Incitec Pivot, Toyota, the CEO's driven that balance in the organization. So it hasn't been tactically flying down to the lowest levels and doing little widget stuff. It's integratively keeping the organization balanced and doing the right stuff. I'd love to hear a perspective from you. About 25, 28, 30 years ago, Sam Walton made the decision to give visibility to major suppliers as to what was the daily sales that were flowing through our stores. And at the time in retail, that was earth-shattering because you generally held it as competitively sensitive information. You didn't want them to know. But ultimately, he made the decision that by holding that information to your chest, you add cost because you have bad estimations taking place in the lack of data.
I agree with you that there's already a lot of data out there. And so I think what's happened now is that we have moved from a lack of data being the problem to the challenge of predicting consumption. The reactions and the speed and the volatility around demand today is just extraordinary. You know, I was jokingly saying, and it's probably Anthony, my corporate affairs guy, is getting nervous because whenever I pause and kind of look around, he's like, "Oh Lord, what's he going to say?"
Don't worry,
now?
Anthony. It's fine.
But you know, the Express, which I came out of it prior to retail, the Express industry breathed a collective sigh of relief when the A380 freighter issue meant that a lot of orders were canceled. You know, there was a natural curve expectation as to what demand was going to do that just plummeted, and it plummeted fast. In 2008, it was whiplash levels. And for anyone who's within the logistics industry, no one expected. We still see the reverberations of it today. It's probably now, although slightly extended, more of a W recovery that we're dealing with given the declines that we're seeing today. So in that environment where you're not able to rationally predict stable demand, you end up with not only the wastage that comes into it, but also the implications of, you know, down to even levels of farmers, right? You've got a lot of farmers who really don't know what to do when it comes September in the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, they just really don't know what to do in terms of planting because no one can really predict what demand is going to look like in the next 12 months. So I think it's gone from the lack of visibility in the supply chain. Collectively in this room, if somebody were to tell us in June of next year, here's demand, would we be able to come up with the most cost-efficient, absolutely perfect supply chain? The fact is no one knows what it is in June, and therefore you have estimations throughout that entire process that wreaks havoc on overall global material and supply chain estimates and calculations, et cetera, et cetera.
So maybe
Sorry,
go ahead,
can
Peter.
I also, this idea too, because I find enough data and enough consultants to tell us what the optimal supply, or actually, and we heard yesterday, there is no optimal, only business appropriate, but how this stuff should flow. And I'll actually challenge a little bit, because I'll ask all of you, how many of you, raise your hand, how many of you heard of the Port of Salalah before 3 days ago? All right, so only about 50% of the room. How many of you heard about the Port of Salalah in the context that it had 4 million TEUs a year flowing through it? Yeah, okay, even less. So this idea of, and now if we take a look at the legacy supply chains and the amount of cargo that gets distributed to East Africa and to India and to the southern Red Sea out of Dubai, which has an additional 7 to 10 days minimum worth of time in inventory, whether it be on the water, sitting in a warehouse in Dubai, or coming back out. The question would be why? What consultant developed that? What person developed that? Now, I mean, Dubai 10 years ago, absolutely, Salalah was barely new. It was not on the map at all, let alone for 50% of the room today. So it's understandable. But it's been 10 to 12 years. So now when do things start to change? How do people start to develop their supply chains around what the capabilities are now? What IT systems have the data for the new ports that have been developed over the last decade, the new logistics locations that actually, when you look at a map, make the most sense, and actually locations like Oman made the most sense all the way back to the Silk Route, right? I mean, this is how it was started at one point. So when these things come about, how do places get their name out other than advertising or having individual meetings? And there's a lot of people to meet. Business changes. And I think we can say that there's enough data out there, but the question is it really getting to the right people? So I mean, and I echo this idea of demand. You know, we see that also, and demand it's constantly shifting, not just within this own room about how much food is wasted, but country to country, GDP, Arab Spring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this idea of cruise missile, being able to direct that demand to the right locations, I think is what I would suggest is appropriate.
Yeah, I think, Scott, that would be, because you did a great job of scoping the complexity issue. I think the group would benefit from hearing your perspective on the how. How are you approaching that at Walmart today?
Oh, geez. If I had an answer to that question. Well, let me start by saying I'm glad I'm not a Greek retailer right now, because that's a demand dynamic that is going to be nearly impossible to predict. We do a lot of research, but even today, if we look at, for example, Japan. So we have quite a large business in Japan. And if you were to look what happened in terms of supply-demand dynamics in the last 12 months, okay, the triple disaster is a one-off. We've now since emerged from that, we've recovered. And if I look forward now, the next 12 months, trying to predict the sentiment of the average Japanese customer is very difficult. And, it's situational based on the world economy. Because you have such an interconnected global economy, it now has such a fast impact on the domestic consumption that it's very difficult to do in isolation forward-looking types of research that give you a high level of certainty. All of my example in China, 12 months ago, who would have ever considered that domestic consumption or even GDP would fall below 9 or 10%? We're now seeing something number lower than that that's having an effect. So, maybe we get it 75, 80% accurate, and that's better than 50 or 60, but that last 10 or 20% is very, very difficult to try and predict. And we tend to overestimate, which then has the impact. Out of stock is never good, so then you have wastage that equals cost. It's not good for sustainability and environmental initiatives. I don't necessarily have a how. We think that we do it pretty well. Every day we look and we see that even that is insufficient, and we need to do better every single day. But it comes down to demand predictability. Like I said, if everyone knew exactly how many apples were going to be consumed in June of 2013, we could design the perfect supply chain. The problem is no one can tell you how many apples are going to be consumed in June of 2013 with anything accuracy of plus or minus 10%. That 10% is pretty important.
Great. I think we have a question from the back.
Raja from SP Jain. Today's company's success does not depend only on managing their own supply chains. A lot more depends on how do we manage the supplier's value chain as well as the customer's value chain. Can panel throw some discussions on it?
I think that I agree, but I can only speak from a retail viewpoint. So, you see a lot of folks, when you talk about this topic, default to the P&Gs, the Coca-Colas, the very big multinationals. We have very strong strategic relationships with all of those companies. We have long discussions around forecasting, days on hand. We have metrics. I have joint meetings with the heads of those companies on a biannual basis. That in itself, I think we do very well. But that represents maybe 10% of what we sell in a China or in India. 95, 98% plus of what we sell in any country is generally domestically sourced. Some of it is imported, but it's domestically sourced. And really where the challenge comes is the medium and the small enterprises, and particular around produce and meat. This is where I think every retailer struggles in that collaboration around supply chain, because you're actually filtering down to a little economic microcosm. And although you're trying to make rational store of the community decisions, your systems are pretty much gauged to average. And, maybe something's going on in a small town that is not necessarily picked up in the machine, whereas if you're talking to Coca-Cola, you can move the products around. You can move from one state to the next state or from one city to the next city, whereas you get into areas like meat and produce, it's more difficult. So I agree that a high level of supplier collaboration is very important. It is sophisticated, it is EDI-driven among the multinationals, and it works very, very well. I think that the next generation of challenge comes to the small and medium enterprises where you keep 3 to 4 days on hand of inventory. That dynamic is very, very difficult to manage.
In fact, there is a good example of collaboration in automobile industry and electronic industry where the suppliers and the manufacturers share a lot of information, their future design, their data, demand data, and that helps them to collaborate to come up with the next generation of products, which is what is required, demanded by the customer. And so, to my mind, different industries have different challenges and different solutions as far as supplier collaboration, supplier value chain is concerned.
Yeah, no doubt collaboration is critical. That may be a good jumping off point for us to kind of turn the table to the sustainability agenda. Mm-hmm. Paul, make your case to Scott. What do you believe really makes sustainability one of the most important issues for a CEO to consider as it relates to the sustainability of the supply chain?
I guess at the risk of ruining your morning as well as your evening last night, let me make your current complexity look very simple by comparison. And that issue is that, we talked last night about the idea that climate impacts in Russia and America can drive the Arab Spring, can lead to military conflict in Libya, can lead to change of regime. Like that, the system is so connected, as we all know now. And I guess the basic pitch I would make on the supply chain side is that the complexity we see today is like the warm-up act in that process. That Scott mentioned before the idea that we can have a middle-class aspirational standard of living around the world is actually just not possible in terms of resource constraint. And we kind of all agree with that, right? And we all see that end is coming, if you like, that the model doesn't work, yet we're not planning for it. And to me, the way that translates is that we can't imagine how it will change, therefore it will keep on going, which therefore means we're kind of sleepwalking ourselves, towards the cliff where the change occurs. And I think, Scott, your example of China and the kind of people there saying, I'm a bit nervous about the European debt crisis, therefore I'll hold back on how many pairs of shorts I buy, is again, we're coming to a much bigger crunch in that regard. And the reason that's so important to me is because we all agree it's coming. We all agree that we can see how it quickly moves globally. Floods in Bangkok, nuclear disaster in Japan and so on translates globally quickly. And yet we're sort of not planning for the level of disruption that we know is going to occur at some point. So my sort of challenge is, how do we think about that in the supply chain context? How do we think about fear, if you like, gripping the global consumer, right? And how that will become self-replicating and therefore demand and managing those issues becomes more and more complex. And my kind of core challenge therefore is, what do we do about that? Because currently we're waiting for it to come. And when I travel the world talking about my book and what that means for society, the general response is, I can see the logic, may or may not be that fast or that bad, but I can see where we're going, but I feel powerless in response. And my sort of challenge is that one to the supply chain and the business community is, what are we going to do to prepare for that moment and how we're going to reduce the impact at that time? Because otherwise we're in kind of a spiralling decline. And that, of course, is not just bad for society, it's bad for business as well. And so, therefore, proactively managing that, I think, is a big challenge.
Scott, reaction?
Yeah, he said the same thing at breakfast. I'd separate it between today's demand and future demand. Mm-hmm. As a company, Walmart is focused around today's demand, and I think there is so much more that we can do around today's demand to create a far more sustainable approach relative to not only the environment, but also the impact that we have upon just the planet to supply. So, You know, if you were to look at palm oil and the damage that the sustainable palm oil industry has upon the planet, it's astronomical. We are putting to bear the pressure that we can apply to move to 100% sustainable palm oil-driven products. Hugely complex. Trust me, there's palm oil and things that you'd never even consider. Man, that's been quite an education for me to understand just how ubiquitous the use of palm oil has become, and therefore the benefit of turning this into a more sustainable industry. But if you were to now then take all of the best efforts, and if we did everything we can to improve today, it's not going to come close to addressing the future demand issue. If you were to look at just the sheer numbers of middle class that is coming out of just two countries, India and China, and you see what the media drives in terms of what an aspirational lifestyle is, it is generally around consumerism and a standard of living driven by things and stuff. And I, as a personal hypothesis, believe that everyone in this room has 4 times, 5 times the responsibility than a scrub farmer in India or a day laborer in China relative to figuring out how to change that pattern. If we continue to drive an awareness around a consumption that is not sustainable, then it becomes an issue of the haves and the have-nots. So I think today's companies, all of them collectively, have a huge responsibility to reduce the impact by X%. Greenhouse gases, sustainable products. A lot of the statistics and the metrics that Walmart has globally made very public commitments to reducing, that in itself is not going to be enough to try and provide that same level of products 10 and 20 years from now, when the population of the planet can go up by another 1 or 2 billion, depending upon which estimate. So I think it's 2 very distinct issues. Fixing today's while figuring out what we're going to do about this consumption pattern that we're embedding in the world's middle class.
Now, let me just come back on part of that, because I think Walmart is a very good example of what I argued last night, that for supply chain people, knowing what your carbon intensity is in the product, knowing how to manage that, knowing whether your palm oil comes from companies that are taking away orangutan forest in Borneo, right? Knowing whether there's human rights abuses in your supply chain. So whatever happens in the future and however it unfolds, knowing what that is becomes really important. And Walmart, I think, has been particularly good in that regard. As Scott said, knowing about palm oil and what the consequences are and investigating that. And that's, it's a very good example of that process, that the discovery journey that you've been on in terms of palm oil, right, is the discovery journey when we kind of need everyone to go on to understand the sustainability attributes. Not because it's a nice thing to do because you don't want to be seen to be, killing orangutans in Borneo, but because it becomes a core part of your business. And that to me is a really significant mindset shift that some companies have gone through, but 80% haven't yet, to recognise this is not just a reputational question. It's actually a core part of the business. So knowing that information, having chain of custody, right, knowing where your stuff comes from, not just in terms of a physical, is it there on time at the right price, but what does it mean for orangutans here? What does it mean for climate change there? What does it mean for human rights over here? Those issues are becoming core questions, and so the kind of crunch that I see coming, the sort of clash of ideas, if you like, between the aspiration and the physics of supply, right? However that unfolds, having the knowledge, having transparency on that becomes a crucially important question.
And to build on what Paul is saying, it's difficult in some parts of the world, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of parts of the world, at least where I am today, gas prices are subsidized. So, how do you make it work? If I had so for an example, let's go to what we're doing in Salalah. Regardless of the subsidy, we're actually investing in a technology that will allow us to take 90 diesel generators out of our yard cranes and plug them into the electrical grid. So that'll save 17,000 tons of CO2 a year. Now, as an economic project, it doesn't pay back. I mean, it's really actually not workable. But in the long term, we see it as an investment, one, for risk mitigation in case subsidies go away, in case as oil runs out, et cetera, et cetera. and it's also the right thing to do, right? Same thing with water savings, and APM Terminals has gone to entirely green sources of energy in Rotterdam and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a necessity to do, but it's very difficult in some parts of the world where they almost make it an obstacle to make it happen.
Actually, that is what really started during the deliberation on environment, and when the countries did not agree in Copenhagen. In fact, it started a different chain reaction. Nobody is regulating, so we can get away with whatever we are doing. But we must realize that sooner or later the regulatory environment is going to change, and better be prepared to meet that day instead of waiting for it to happen. And on that day we would be caught unawares.
Yeah. And just quickly, just say, recognising that's right, points out that there is a great opportunity in being ahead of the curve on this one.
Yeah.
That the change is going to happen. The only sort of two choices are that we kind of collapse as a global economy or else we respond. If we respond, then being ready for that process and being ahead of the curve.
And I know we've got a couple
Is a
questions,
benefit.
but one observation for the group. I think yesterday we spent some time talking about how important it is to look at operational excellence and drive the tactical improvements, but at the same time have an eye for the future and design. Scott, your comments have followed that thinking exactly. I think, Paul, the commentary back to you, just in terms of your statements, would be this idea of sleepwalking toward the cliff. I think this is an audience that really believes that we're not. And it's just not well understood in every case how much work is actually happening to take advantage and to be considerate of the future. But let's get, I know there are a couple of questions here that might be good to add to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I'm John Sicard from Canaxis. So in the last couple of days, we've talked a lot about volatility, about complexity of the supply chain, design of the supply chain, it having both a physical dimension and the human dimension. So I want to drive a question towards the human dimension here a little bit. As Scott said, the degree of volatility is increasing. The likelihood that you can predict what demand will be tomorrow has never been more difficult. So if you're a CEO, what new core competency would you want to drive in your organizations today? New skills that those individuals need to have that they may not have. A lot of people talk about plan better, if we had a better plan, and yet everyone is saying we have no idea where the next catastrophe will be. We have no idea what demand will be. So it occurs to me that maybe some of the solution is driven towards, the human side of the supply chain versus the physical. I'd like the panel to discuss that.
Yeah, that's a perfect transition point
Yeah.
for us. Rajiv, that's your issue here for the group. So.
Absolutely. Actually, it should start with the CEO putting in place a person who perfectly understands how the supply chain behaves. And let me take you back to a very interesting seminal research paper called "Are You the Weakest Link in the Supply Chain?" written a few years back by Mentzer and Baum. One of the key research areas as a part of that paper was that when the companies were asked, how many of you have a qualified, experienced person to head your supply chain initiatives, and it was found that only 20% of the organizations had a person who had an insight into what goes on into the supply chain. The remaining of them, through the executive development programs, certification programs, and on the job, have acquired the necessary skills. One very good example, in the Middle East recently we have carried out a similar research to find that what is the state of supply chain talent in the Middle East is, and we came out with very similar results. To give you an example, in one of the companies, a person who was doing phenomenally well as a head of marketing was shifted to supply chain because the CEO went to a similar supply chain seminar and found that, oh wow, this is the next thing we must do. And he also heard that reducing the number of SKUs is something which is a magic bullet. And he asked this person to reduce the number of SKUs. Now, no self-respecting marketing head is ever going to agree to reduce the number of SKUs. And he sat on it. Just imagine the catastrophe that brought the lack of action of this person who had little understanding of how the supply chain works. So the moral of the story is that the first starting point is to have people with a thorough understanding of supply chain. I realize that today we are educating the first generation of supply chain talent. These are the people in 5 to 10 years' time are going to be the decision makers. They are going to bring in the skills and over a period of time the experience to understand how to react to the changing demand. And one more thing which I would like to add here is that the way consumer is buying is changing very rapidly. It is not only the Walmart store or a brick or mortar store where he is going. He is finding numerous avenues to create demand, and it is now the challenge for all of us to understand in how many ways we react to the demand, what suits our business, what is the appropriate format in which we must have a supply chain which senses the demand and then reacts to the demand.
So again, Scott, another big issue, right? This question of talent.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view. I don't
Sure.
disagree with you. I don't think that I don't think we're at the first generation. I do think we're at the second generation. I think that the first generation is a bit self-taught and technically trained. I think that we're getting to the first generation where there's a mass of technical trained logisticians. If I were to look on my last 10, 15 years of experience, I've had the opportunity to be a part of a logistics provider and therefore sat across the table from the heads of supply chain, the head of logistics of many companies. I'm now on the opposite side of the table. I think that we've gone through just a market shift during that period. When we started out 10 or 15 years ago, supply chains were simplistic. Generally, anyone could end up in supply chain, and the ones who did were usually the ones who weren't doing their other job very well, right? I mean, that was kind of what was required to get put into logistics. We then went into a period where I think the cost of logistics as a percent of revenue for most companies became meaningful, and therefore supply chain became an important part of the overall corporate sort of planning. Generally, though, it was stuck within the finance department or within manufacturing, and it was a part of. Today, I believe that logistics has an equal seat at the table, that if you look at the total management profile, you have much fewer examples of marketing being shifted over.
Oh, that's a good news.
Don't tell me the name of the company. That's just asking a dog to meow, right? I mean, it's just, they'll not succeed. I don't care how good the folks are below them, they won't have the technical understanding to be able to make good decisions. If I were to look at the gap that I see is that there are lots of people who understand the technical aspects of logistics. They're struggling to manage in an environment of ambiguity. And what I find in general is you get logistics and supply chain people who say, give me the number and I'll get it there. But if you don't give me a number, it's not my fault. And they're not engaging enough in the process of understanding the cost of risk mitigating numbers. And so to me, what I think is missing is that general management view being trained into individuals who are coming out as technicals. So if you train a CPA or a tax auditor you generally try and beat ambiguity out of them because that's what their jobs are. And I think in some way logistics went down that line. It became a very technical 1 + 1 = 2. And back to the whole challenge of managing very volatile demand, there needs to now move almost to where supply chain can move up into general management purely because of the ability to manage in ambiguity. That to me is the biggest gap that exists today when I deal with a lot of supply chain people. They don't know how to do it. They don't know how to monetize it. They don't know how to communicate it. They don't know how to influence their way so that there's a clear understanding of the enterprise as to how supply chain can be a part of the solution, as opposed to just a very technical, give it to me, then I'll deal with it. Up till that point, I don't really want to engage.
Scott, just curious, is that something you hire for, or is that something you develop?
That's a very good question. I think that you hire for the technical ability. You have to have the right mindset plus training to have them deal with the ambiguity specific to your industry. Right? And it is very industry specific. You raised automotive. You know, automotive is entirely different than retail. The capital intensity and the supply demand dynamics are quite different between the two. I think the ambiguity piece is a mindset that comes through the education, understanding in every one of your supply chain courses. And by the way, there's this piece over here that you're never going to have a black and white answer to, and this is how potentially you can deal with it. I think that's where the training can come in terms of the education process on ambiguity being throughout that entire. Then I think corporations, companies, industries have a responsibility to try and drive a level of understanding of the ambiguity that's unique to that particular company or industry.
Is there anything in that arena that you all are doing that would be worth sharing?
Direct farm. We have in China and in India, we have seen back to the responsibility to manage today's demand better. We've embarked upon direct farm programs. So the direct farm programs are basically, through the research that we've done, the ability to remove waste through all of the middlemen that generally, you know, from point that it's picked to when it's forked, there's a lot of ways for products to be molested in that supply chain. Is by going direct, you remove all the middlemen. And by doing that, not only are you able to increase the livelihood of the farmer, you're able to increase the freshness, you're able to reduce the cost, and you're also able to improve the food security. But it's very complex. And you deal with the impact of weather, you impact of supply-demand dynamics. It is a very ambiguous arena. And so when you look at the skill set required to manage the logistics of supply chain within our direct farm program, I'm coming to the realization that it's slightly different than someone who manages the supply chain logistics of dry goods or even longer lead time general merchandise products that you could put on a missile, to use your metaphor. And so to me, if I were to look at the individuals that you see technically trained, I think that the education industry now needs to go to the next level of, you know, not focusing on, you know, 3PLs now becoming 4PLs, and, you know, that sort of theoretical is even getting down to far more technical detail around the types of product supply chains that are going to be required to manage what is now quite global in terms of demand and supply dynamics.
I think this really, as you can imagine, in my area, I'm not short of opportunities to do things in the world because there's lots of stuff going on in this space. And I choose to spend 25% of my time thereabouts on this issue of how do you engage corporate executives, right, on the knowledge they need on sustainability to do their job. And they're not people who specialise in sustainability. I teach at the University of Cambridge program in the US and Australia and South Africa and Cambridge, naturally. And it's about taking people who are supply chain managers, CFOs, you know, senior executives who are not focusing on sustainability and giving them a 4-day kind of immersion in sustainability to understand what the drivers are. Not because they'll become sustainability experts, but so they know what questions to ask. And they know that actually palm oil from there matters over here. They know that climate change can impact on my supply chain over there. So that idea, to go to your question, of taking people who have the technical expertise and giving them enough knowledge about the big issues and the global complexity and volatility to know when to ask the right question and when to think about something being important, I think is crucially important, because we haven't got time to kind of teach everyone sustainability at a high level of expertise, but we do have enough capacity for corporations to understand how these issues impact on their business. And that immersion, I think, is a very important part of the process.
And Scott, that's what I'm hearing you say, is the opportunity to immerse your talent in a different level of challenge, and really put them front and center in an ambiguity. Really test their skill to take the game to the next level. And I would assume that's the talent you're looking for to
Yes.
take to the next level.
And this idea of ambiguity, I mean, we can say, so what skill do we need? And the skill to operate in ambiguity, I actually, if I break it down for what I look like, because we have just as much ambiguity in the ports industry as anybody else, it's problem solving, it's initiative, and it's a constant desire to learn. If you hire somebody with those three abilities, you will go a long way toward being able to operate with what, in the military you call commander's intent. So then a leader can go ahead and put out a vision. He can put out, says, this is where I want us to go into the future, and allow all of the people below him to execute regardless of the ambiguity, and only seek advice when absolutely necessary. Because there is no way that any of us as CEOs can answer every single question that comes up during the middle of the day from all of the staff. They have to be able to operate, and not everything is SOP. Not everything can be laid out, and there is too much complexity and there is too much ambiguity. So learning, initiative, and problem-solving skills. And actually, in fairness, I think education at a lower level is failing in these. It's not doing enough to help problem-solving skills rather than rote learning. I've operated now in 4 different countries, and I see a significant amount of focus moving in education over toward rote learning and scores on tests versus figuring out, how does this work if I don't have all of the numbers, right? And then being able to take a decision with 80% gut. And that's a bit of a cultural issue in some locations, but you'll never know everything. You have to reflect that.
I have a take on this. What you are saying is that many things cannot be done through the numbers. You cannot crunch the numbers to come out with a solution, and a lot of things are intuitive.
That's actually not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you'll never know 100% because ambiguity exists and complexity exists. You have to have the technical skills in order to be able to crunch numbers. And at the same time, you have to be able to figure out what is different than the formula I learned at school.
Sure.
Right? So it's not about knowing what the square root of 9 is, 3. It's about knowing how you got there so that when somebody asks you what's the square root of 73, you can figure out how to get there instead of memorizing it from a table. And this is, I think, those are very simple problems, but at the end of the day, it's about an overall problem. So I think we even heard the other day about collaborative teams. I think the guy from Airbus talked about this, flying by wireless, right? So getting the people around you, who are incredibly smart, hopefully, if you're a good CEO, to work together to solve problems because they understand your intent already, and then working together, talking to each other to break down the silos in order to take the initiative and get there without having to ask your approval, even if they don't have all of the information.
Yeah, good, terrific point. I think we hear that over and over again in terms of just the interpersonal skill to achieve that. The business acumen, I think, is a big part of what we're trying to get at. The functional skill today, my sense, it's almost a given that you've got the ability to do that. That's your ticket in the door. I know, Genevieve, did you have a question or? Oh, back here. Okay, great.
Yeah, just pressing that the direction there of the last conversation a little further, perhaps to suggest for our supply chain design thinking, is it a forlorn hope that we can somehow centrally plan essentially for all that ambiguity and uncertainty And should we really be looking in our supply chain design to have devolve the authority and the autonomy down so that our supply chain is set up to be just a much more adaptive system rather than hoping that we're going to somehow plan it forward?
Boy, you talk about a gift. I'll tell you, we had a great transition question on talent, and now to really think and reflect on our conversation and relate it back to design thinking, innovation, adaptability, alignment. If we could, the slide from the deck that portrays, this is John Gatorna's model that he so eloquently represents in almost every discussion. You know, the operational excellence focus, I think, is what we've talked about. This level of ambiguity and how do you design supply chains to really respond. I'd love to get commentary on that in terms of what it means to achieve a more responsive, adaptable, flexible, agile supply chain. John's position here is that when you look at the sophistication of your management approach, it should consider design of supply chain differently. And then as you think even beyond that, that the next level of alignment is really looking at your partnerships differently and being unafraid to take innovative risk, which I think Walmart's really a great example of really leading the charge on that front and really changing the way business is done. You know, as kind of closing comments, Scott and others here, it would be great to get your reaction to, how do you tie this together and really, make supply chain something that truly advances the effectiveness of the enterprise, makes a real difference today from a forward-looking view.
I actually think John's model's correct. He didn't pay me to say that, by the way. And I think it depends by industry, quite honestly, where you are. To me, this is about removing the inefficiencies as you globalize your supply chains. And depending upon the industry, where you are in that process to be able to create consortiums. It's all about removing the inefficiencies and trying to mitigate all of the volatility within supply, demand, and marrying those together. But there are industries that are probably the most impactful to the planet, most impactful to the daily life, that are not even close to achieving that top level. So I would talk about produce and meat. Those types of industries are not close yet to being able to achieve that more rational design, purely because they're so hideously fragmented. And I think that you run into geopolitics and regulatory environments. I can't take pork from one state to the next state or province in China. I can't take some aspects of produce from one state in India to another state in India. So there is all of these artificial constraints from very rational approach to removing inefficiency and trying to mitigate that volatility. I think that eventually, if you were to say, how do we get to today's current demand having the least negative impact, it's having all industries having achieved their way through this type of approach and arriving at very rational types of consortiums and efficient supply chains. I just think that we're still a long way off. There's a lot of work to be done. I think that the regulators, I don't say politicians, the regulators have an important role to play in that process. There is somewhat levels of self-interest that are not helpful to the process, that drive cost and therefore inefficiency into the process. And frankly, you can point fingers at every country in the world who sometimes you look at the rules on the books and you scratch your head thinking, good Lord, what were they thinking when they came up with this one? And I know everyone in the room has dealt with those. So from a model, I think it's the right model. The challenge is getting every single part of the world's demand of products up that curve to be able to arrive at that very efficient and rational model that allows the highest level of connection between supply and demand at the lowest cost.
Terrific perspective. I think we have time for one more question. Is there one from the floor? Yes.
Yes, please. do you believe as CEOs that we need crisis in order to develop better supply chains? To give you...
Could you repeat that one more
Do
time?
you believe as a CEO that we need crisis to design better supply chains? There's a
To give you an example, in all the people here knows about the Greece crisis. Maybe very few knows about the food reutilization movement and the social convenience stores and supermarkets around Greece. Is a full flexible supply chain. Maybe the people don't know about this because the advertisement is out of the code of ethics of this movement. And to give you an example, talk about what happened with the food of this morning. People with a hotline could be here, not in Singapore, around Athens, and collect carefully this food and repack and redistribute to people via these convenience stores and the supermarket, not for poor people only, but people like us, middle-class people, losing, due to the crisis, the meaning lives, and they need this material for sure. This is a movement without sophisticated, ERP systems, blah, blah. It's a voluntary movement using internet, using mobiles, using hotlines, and so on. It's very successful, and maybe very few know this. But it's not only the movement, it's a full flexible supply chain due to the crisis. And I think it could be an example to develop better supply chains using crisis as a tool.
That's perfect, because I think it ties to kind of an opening point you made, Scott. Paul, I think it ties to your thoughts in terms of, sometimes we do need a crisis to make things happen.
Should we need a crisis? No. Right? Intellectually, everyone knows that we're faced with a dilemma that needs solutions. I think the problem is that humans by nature are optimistic. And within optimism becomes emotional delusions. Somebody will sort it out and it won't impact my life. And I think, therefore, history has shown that crises is what actually forces change to the massive population who are not appropriately dealing. And I think a crisis probably will have to occur before we see significant progress on some of these topics, much like wars, national disasters, economic crises seem to be the mechanisms by which the globe gets its act together. During the good times, you don't see a lot of forethought and thinking that requires a level of compromise or giving something up. So humans aren't very rational, really, if you think about it.
And it should be said, we're really good in a crisis as well, as your example shows, as we've seen in war, we've seen in many situations when the going gets tough, we actually behave much better. It's like when things are going well, we behave badly. When things are going badly, we behave well, right? And so I think that sense of the crisis is getting ready for that moment is really about the opportunity for dramatic change at that point. And I think business plays a role in that, supply chain in particular, but society as a whole does respond to the need, right? And we are capable of doing that amazingly quickly when the moment comes.
I think the key to that, though, is that crisis creates opportunities far greater than they do on a normal day-to-day basis also. And crisis creates the will to politically or regulatorily change to allow for the change in business practices, et cetera. But I think if we said that we only perform best or we only change, we need a crisis to change, we wouldn't be where we are today in many other areas of business and opportunity. From Google to et cetera, to Apple, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are opportunities people saw in the future and took, but crisis maybe focuses on particular areas when we don't face a crisis every day, right? Right now, there's almost everything is labeled as a crisis. The economic crisis, the Greek crisis, the food crisis, the climate change crisis, it's so on and so forth. We almost get desensitized a bit, I think.
Terrific. Well, I've enjoyed this conversation. I hope you all have found it valuable as well. I would just close by saying, Scott, I think as I reflect on what we've heard from you today and a little bit of research that was done recently on what makes CEOs effective leaders. There were really 3 points. Inspiring through demonstrating realistic optimism. I think you demonstrated that well in just your openness on the challenges that we face today. The second point is a subservience to purpose. So really keeping the bigger goals in mind and bringing motivation through that to those that are around you. And then the third point is finding order in chaos. So as we look at the hideous level of ambiguity that's out there and your ability to drive clarity on what's near term that you clearly view you have control over, and the longer term issues that will require more debate, more development of our people, more education, more cruise missiles. You really did a fantastic job of taking questions, balancing perspective, and helping, I think, this group advance their thinking in terms of their relationship that they should seek with their CEO. So thank you very much for being with us. Panelists, very much appreciate it. Thank you.